Tonight, we examine an Albany cold case that remained in the shadows for over 60 years. It finally has an ending. Authorities have announced a breakthrough in the 1964 murder of Katherine Blackburn. Her life was a study in precision. Mass every Sunday morning at 6 o'clock sharp. The porch swept every Saturday evening without fail. 30 years at the same post. A clean home. Bills settled. She moved with a rhythm so consistent that neighbors used it to set their watches. But her discipline provided no protection from what was coming. In September 1964, Katherine Blackburn, aged 50, answered a knock at her front door. She let a stranger in. Within hours, the 50-year-old was beaten, stabbed, and subjected to torture with heated kitchen blades before being left on her own floor in Albany, New York. The assailant stepped out and disappeared into the night. There was no arrest. No trial followed. For 61 years, her family carried the weight, scrubbing her blood from the walls with their own hands. They lived out their decades waiting for a resolution that seemed impossible, until the silence finally broke. This is the investigation into how one of New York's most vicious cold cases was finally brought into the light. It was not a confession or a witness that did it. It was a single handkerchief, concealed beneath the victim for over 6 decades. To understand the resolution, one must first look at the woman herself. Who was Katherine Blackburn? Her habits and her history provide the context for her final moments. Katherine Beck arrived on March 1, 1914, born to Polish immigrants in Albany. Raised with a brother and 5 sisters, their world was defined by the Catholic faith. This was a devotion that transcended Sunday morning rituals. Religion dictated every choice she made and every bond she formed. It occupied every corner of her existence. For Kate, as she was known, this spiritual anchor became her greatest asset, and eventually her most heavy cross. An early decision would prove irreversible. It remained a quiet shadow over her life for years to come. On July 3, 1938, the 24-year-old married Jesse Blackburn. The ceremony took place at City Hall, not within the sanctuary of a church. Jesse's status as a divorcee meant that, under strict religious law, a traditional wedding was forbidden. Regret surfaced quickly. As a member of the United States Army Air Corps, Jesse's life was one of constant motion transfers to the West Coast and deployments abroad. Kate preferred the familiar streets of Albany. She refused to distance herself from her sisters. Their correspondence revealed a stark reality. The two shared almost nothing in common. She was the embodiment of order and discipline. He was unstable, impulsive, and perpetually in debt. Their cohabitation was brief. Yet, Kate never sought a divorce. To her, it was not an option. Ending a marriage was a transgression against God. She had sworn an oath, and she would honor it regardless of his actions. They occupied separate worlds. Jessie eventually relocated as far away as Japan. She remained in Albany, dedicating 30 years of her life to the Mohawk Brush Company. She rose from the factory floor to the rank of forewoman. Through those decades, Jesse sent the occasional message. There were even letters from his other women. When Jesse's funds ran low, Kate would wire him cash, bound by her own sense of duty. She was a woman anchored by principles, even when those principles caused her pain. There was a hidden side to her life, a secret she kept from her closest kin. They wouldn't learn the truth until the day she was buried. We will revisit that later. In 1964, at age 50, she lived alone in her 2-family house at 117 Colony Street. It was a blue-collar neighborhood in North Albany. Her property was meticulous. Petunias in shades of pink and white sat in the window boxes. She occupied the lower level, leasing the upper flat for additional support. Those who knew her spoke of her kindly. She was reserved, private and gentle. She was entirely predictable. The neighbors used her movements to mark the passing hours. Saturday evenings meant sweeping the porch. Sunday mornings at 6 o'clock meant the walk to Mass at St. Joseph's. Each workday, Marie Hogan would arrive at the curb, Kate would be waiting for their commute to the factory. Her life was defined by that structure. The moment it faltered, the alarm bells began to ring. Saturday, September 12, 1964. Kate finished a half shift at the factory and returned home at midday. The upper floor was vacant. Her previous tenants had departed following a loss in their own family. She had listed the vacancy in the local newspaper. The final advertisement appeared on September 4th, just 8 days prior. She mentioned finding a replacement, a man of short stature in his 50s. He provided a $10 deposit for an October 1st move-in. He claimed he was moving with his mother, but Kate reportedly felt an uneasy intuition about the man. Every discovery regarding the man only deepened her growing sense of dread. He claimed to reside at 369 2nd Avenue, a prestigious Albany enclave. Kate's reality was different. Her neighborhood was defined by labor and grit. A move from prosperity to her modest street defied logic. It was a red flag she could not ignore. Suspicion turned to alarm when he arrived for the viewing reeking of liquor. 3 days before she would be found dead, on the night of Wednesday, September 9th, she sought help to investigate the address the man had provided. She needed to verify for herself if his story held any truth. The identity of her driver involves a secret Kate guarded from her kin, a detail for later. That night, they drove towards 2nd Avenue. The location existed. However, the darkness of the night obscured the specific numbers on the houses. They retreated without clarity. Kate's questions remained unanswered. Within 72 hours, she was gone. Between 5 and 6 in the evening on Saturday the 12th, witnesses observed her performing her usual ritual, sweeping the front porch. That was the final sighting of Katherine Blackburn. Shortly after, she answered a call from one of her sisters. Her sister offered to bring a meal for dinner. Kate declined. A prospective tenant was scheduled to view the apartment. That conversation was the last time her voice was heard. On Sunday morning, Kate's seat at the 6 a.m. Mass was empty. She missed the 8 a.m. service as well. For a woman of such unwavering faith, this absence was an immediate alarm. As the day progressed, neighbors noted her laundry lines remained bare. Her trash remained unburnt. These were the immutable rhythms of her life, now broken. Silence settled over the house until Monday morning. Marie Hogan arrived for their routine carpool. The house remained still. Marie knocked, but no one came to the door. Sensing trouble, Marie contacted Sandy, Kate's 19-year-old niece. Sandy decided to investigate before her own shift began. She invited her sister, Mary Ann, but the girl was tied to her school schedule. Having just entered the 10th grade, Mary Ann stayed behind. Sandy brought her Aunt Anna instead. They stood at the door, knocking. Silence. Sandy began tossing small stones at the window panes, desperate for a sign of life. There was none. They discovered the cellar entrance was unbolted. Entering through the basement, they reached the common foyer and found the apartment door unlocked. They stepped inside. The lower level was deserted. Kate was nowhere to be found. Knowing Kate had been prepping the upper unit with fresh paint for the new occupant, Sandy and Anna climbed the stairs. The door to the upstairs apartment stood ajar. There, on the living room floor, they found her. At just 19, Sandy scrambled to call for medical aid. When the first responders arrived, however, life-saving measures were not an option. They summoned the detectives. Katherine Blackburn's life had been violently taken. The scene investigators encountered was among the most harrowing in the history of the city. The horror lay in the cold calculation of the act. This was no spontaneous explosion of temper. It was a slow, systematic display of sadism. The assailant turned the sanctity of the home against the victim. Her kitchen and her personal effects became his instruments. The tools of her demise were all sourced from within her own walls. Though found in the living room, her life ended elsewhere. Forensic evidence traced the initial struggle to the threshold between the kitchen and the rear bedroom. Kate had escorted the man upstairs to showcase the vacant unit. While she moved to retrieve keys from a lockbox downstairs, The killer likely secured a small hammer or kitchen tool unnoticed. Once they were upstairs, he delivered multiple crushing blows to the back of her head, fracturing her cranium. The injuries extended to her hands. She had instinctively shielded her skull during the assault, her fingers catching the weight of the following strikes. Her final conscious moment was an attempt at self-preservation. She fell, losing consciousness on the floor. The intruder then returned downstairs. With chilling composure, he selected a blade from her own kitchen drawer. He ascended once more, rolled Kate onto her back, and drove the steel into her neck and throat. The final wound opened the carotid artery. Kate bled out in the very space she had hoped would provide her an income. Yet the violence did not conclude with her death. He descended the stairs again. He forced open a cedar chest to retrieve a linen sheet and took pillows from the victim's own bed. He moved the body into the living room and made a futile attempt to mop up the massive amount of blood. The effort failed. He discarded the soaked fabric. The blood eventually filtered through the floorboards into the apartment below. The assailant handled the victim with clinical cruelty, shoving her clothing upward until the fabric gathered tightly at her throat. After removing her remaining garments, the lack of power in the upper unit forced him into the darkness of the kitchen below. There, he ignited the gas range, resting Kate's own cutlery over the blue flames. He watched and waited as the steel reached a temperature designed to sear. Carrying the glowing metal back to the bedroom, he began a methodical ritual, branding precise patterns into her chest and tracing the contours of her mouth. The process was repetitive. Downward for heat, upward for pain. Blade after blade. He remained patient, stashing the tools beneath the stovetop once the mutilation was complete. A sexual violation followed, leaving a microscopic trail of his presence behind. Before vanishing, he performed a final calculated act. He located a small ledger of rent payments kept inside a cabinet in the living area. Kate was diligent, documenting every transaction and deposit within those pages, providing the payer with their proof of payment. A carbon record usually remained. The intruder ripped away the most recent entry and the subsequent 4 pages, removing any trace of the stubs. This was an attempt to purge his identity from the crime scene. He believed the evidence was gone, but he was mistaken. Physics betrays the cautious. Pressure applied to one page leaves an invisible topography on the fibers underneath. Music. Though the physical receipts were destroyed, the indentations remained a ghostly echo of Kate's penmanship. These subtle markings provided a lead, one name that would launch a pursuit across generations and borders, terminating only at a cemetery. At this stage, her kin remained oblivious to her private life. The revelation would come, though the timing could not have been more tragic. Over 1,000 mourners gathered at St. Joseph's Church to pay their final respects to Kate Blackburn. 11 colleagues acted as pallbearers. Operations at the Mohawk Brush Company ceased entirely that day, allowing the workforce to grieve in unison. Detectives observed from the perimeter, scanning the congregants for any sign of a predator returning to the scene of the grief. A recording device was hidden within the coffin, a desperate attempt to capture a whispered apology or a confession. The audio remained silent. Music. The wake unveiled a different truth for the family. Kate had been involved in a committed partnership for 16 years. The man was Ben Mascin. A produce vendor and a polio survivor, he moved through the world with a labored, heavy gait. He resided with his mother and harbored a profound devotion to Kate. Fearing the fallout, Kate kept Ben a secret, as her marriage to Jesse had never been legally dissolved. Faith created a prison. As a devout Catholic, she viewed both her current situation and the prospect of divorce as grave transgressions. Caught in a theological deadlock, she opted for a life of quiet omission to protect her standing with those she loved. Complications extended beyond religion. She was of Polish Catholic descent. Ben was Jewish. In the social climate of 1960s Albany, such a union was controversial. Yet, she found ways to integrate him into her life from the shadows. When young Sandy worked her shifts at Carvel, Kate and Ben watched from a distance, parked where their association remained undetected. She would ask Ben to approach the counter alone, simply so he could witness her niece in person. To Sandy, he was merely a stranger. The girl saw only a patron. Kate's solution to her fractured life was an invisible bridge, keeping her loved ones near while ensuring their worlds never collided. The loss left Ben shattered. He recounted his attempts to visit her on both Saturday and Sunday. Each time, his knocks at the door went unanswered. 10 phone calls were placed over 48 hours, each one ringing into a void. He would never hear her voice again. Authorities cleared him quickly. He was no killer, merely a man mourning a 16-year romance that had been lived in the dark. Following the interment, Sandy and her cousin Teresa returned to the residence on Colony Street. They were barely 20. They undertook a task that haunts the memory of any youth. They scrubbed the stains of their aunt's murder from the floorboards. This was not an assignment, but an act of mercy, sparing their mother the sight of such carnage. The manhunt grew sprawling. Leads were pursued across state lines as the case gained momentum. Investigators scrutinized the Boston Strangler, Albert DeSalvo. His history of preying on isolated women made him a viable person of interest. They also considered Lemuel Smith, a local predator from Amsterdam with a signature for extreme violence and violation. Neither path proved fruitless. The only tangible lead remained that spectral name from the ledger, Robert Broadhead, or a variation thereof. While forensic analysts were certain of the name Robert, the surname remained illegible and elusive. Broadhead, Branstead. Music. The associated location was listed as 369 2nd Avenue. Every Robert in the Capital District was vetted. Every occupant of that 2nd Avenue address was questioned. Music. Search parameters expanded to every house number 369 in the city. Every trail went cold. Music. The identity was a fabrication. The location was a phantom. The perpetrator had vanished into the ether, pursued only by a single, tireless investigator. Lieutenant Ted Flint ensured Kate's dossier never gathered dust. Of all the horrors he witnessed, this was the one that followed him home. The original investigator retired and eventually passed away. His questions about Katherine Blackburn's killer forever unanswered. Time marched on. Months dissolved into years. Years became decades. Kate's home was eventually razed. The very landscape of the neighborhood shifted. The detectives on the case aged. Many died with the file open, yet they never forgot her. Neither did Sandy. In August 2018, a detective named Melissa Mory was stationed within the Albany Police Department's Forensic Investigation Bureau. Her spouse had returned from a gathering with retired officers. They had spent the evening discussing the cases that still haunted them. For those veteran lawmen, the shadow was always the same. Katherine Blackburn. Something resonated within Melissa. Aware that the department maintained an archive of historical evidence, she retrieved Kate's file. The contents were chilling. Every piece of evidence from 1964 remained perfectly preserved. Clothing, bed sheets, knives. The handkerchief recovered from beneath Kate's body was still there, completely intact. Those first detectives, working decades before the advent of DNA, had utilized gloves at the scene. They processed everything with clinical precision. Unknowingly, they had left a legacy for the future, uncertain if anyone would ever possess the tools to use it. Melissa then encountered a detail that felt like providence. Kate's niece, Sandy, who discovered the body at 19, was her own neighbor. They shared the same street. Sandy would often acknowledge Melissa's dog during their neighborhood walks. Melissa was oblivious that this gentle, elderly woman was the living link to one of Albany's most savage, unsolved murders. That November, Dr. Christina Lane established the Cold Case Analysis Center at the College of St. Rose. Sandy Carmichael, now in her 70s, observed the news reports. She did what she had done for 50 years. She reached out. She inquired about potential assistance. The center contacted local police. Melissa Mory was designated to spearhead the renewed inquiry. The structural elements were finally aligning. a persistent detective, a specialized academic facility built for this exact purpose, and a family member who refused to surrender. Over the ensuing years, Melissa and Dr. Lane scrutinized every evidentiary lead. They encountered frequent dead ends. They faced constant rejections and failed attempts. Melissa would later describe cold case work as exhaustive research, long intervals of silence, frequent setbacks. Yet, they eventually identified the correct evidence and the necessary laboratory. The handkerchief was the breakthrough. The fabric recovered from beneath Kate's remains in 1964. In 2023, the Albany Police Department collaborated with Othram, a forensic laboratory based in Texas. A grant from Season of Justice financed the analysis. Technicians used a sterile vacuum system to pull DNA from that 60-year-old fabric. They constructed a sophisticated genetic blueprint through forensic genome sequencing. That profile was then submitted to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Federal agents applied genetic genealogy, the same method used on the Golden State Killer. They found matches to the killer's relatives. By reconstructing ancestral lines, investigators isolated their focus on a single individual, a man who died in 1998. A man never previously suspected. Police contacted his living descendants. They cooperated, providing their own DNA. The data suggested investigators were correct, but they required definitive proof. On the morning of September 15, 2025, 61 years and 1 day after Kate was found, investigators gathered at Albany Rural Cemetery. They held a judicial order. They disturbed the earth of a grave. Samples were taken from a femur and arm bone for analysis. Weeks later, the lab confirmed a perfect match. On October 8, 2025, the chief of police stood before the public and disclosed the killer's identity. Joseph Stanley Nowakowski, born 1931, 33 when he murdered Kate, dead since 1998. His history revealed a predator. At 18, he faced multiple charges for burglary. After his military service, he was apprehended at a train station carrying an arsenal of blades and a loaded handgun. He possessed lockpicks, handcuffs, and architectural layouts of private homes. He used newspapers to track when wealthy families were traveling. This was no common thief. He was a methodical hunter who analyzed his targets. In 1973, an elderly woman in Schenectady woke to a hatchet attack in her own bed. She lived alone. The assailant left behind a single glove and a gold dental crown. Days later, Nowakowski crashed his vehicle while intoxicated. Police discovered a blood-stained hatchet inside the wreckage. The crown matched his teeth. He was sentenced to 3 to 15 years, eventually paroled in 1980. He vanished from the record until his death. He was never linked to Kate Blackburn until a handkerchief finally spoke. Sandy Carmichael stood before the bank of microphones at the press briefing. At 81 years old, she carried a memory from when she was 19, the moment she discovered her aunt's body on that floor. For 61 years, she bore that image in silence. She spoke of an inherent evil that breached her aunt's threshold 6 decades ago, fracturing their lineage. 61 years ago, evil injured my aunt's house and changed our lives forever. Is greater than. She remarked that their petitions had finally been answered, offering gratitude to those who secured this resolution. Mary Ann Simmerd, another niece, posed a question that drained the room of sound. Do you believe in miracles? Her family, she claimed, had just received one. After 61 winters, the killer of Katherine Blackburn finally had a name. Police Chief Cox addressed the crowd, stating, "There's no such thing as a cold case. This is what remains after the headlines fade. It is not the cruelty of the act, nor the complexity of the genetic profile. It is the persistence of those who refuse to let Katherine Blackburn's name dissolve into the anonymity of a police archive." The investigators in 1964 who secured evidence for a future technology they could not yet grasp. Ted Flint, who kept her folder atop his desk until his final day of service. Melissa, who overheard a fragment of the case at a social gathering and felt a sudden weight of responsibility. Music, I Can Do Something. Dr. Lane and Chris Kungle, who established a center on the premise that every forgotten victim is entitled to the truth. The forensic specialists, who extracted a genetic signature from 60-year-old fibers and gave it a human identity. And Sandy, the 19-year-old who scrubbed her aunt's blood from the apartment so her mother wouldn't see it, the woman who never stopped searching for an answer. The woman who reached out one last time in 2018 while in her 70s, finally finding closure in her 81st year. Katherine Blackburn lived as a hostage to her own integrity. She maintained her faith through every season of hardship, regardless of the cost. She remained in a hollow marriage because she believed in the sanctity of her vows. Her true heart remained a secret, hidden to spare her family from the weight of disappointment. Acting as a landlord, she opened her door to a stranger under the simple pretense of renting an apartment. For that solitary act of civility, she paid with her life. Joseph Nowakowski died in 1998, having never been questioned for the crime. He never saw the inside of a courtroom or faced a jury of his peers. By every traditional metric, he evaded the reach of the law. But he could not evade the eventual emergence of the truth. 61 years later, his sanctuary was stripped away. His remains were exhumed and his name was finally spoken not as a man, but as a predator. In that room, an 81-year-old woman who had spent a lifetime waiting finally found her peace. Katherine was laid to rest at St. Agnes Cemetery in 1964. Nowakowski lies in Albany Rural. Only a few miles separate the victim from her killer, a short drive that spanned 6 decades of absolute silence. That silence has been broken. Now, I want to hear your perspective on this resolution. Do you believe Nowakowski's history suggests a pattern of other unsolved atrocities? A man with this methodology stalking solitary women, armed with burglary tools, calculating his strikes. Authorities suspect Katherine may not have been his only target. Share your thoughts below. This resolution only happened because 1964 detectives preserved evidence they couldn't even utilize at the time. How many other forgotten files are resting in evidence lockers, waiting for the science to catch up with the crime? How many predators remain unidentified because a single piece of fabric has yet to be analyzed? And Katherine, who guarded her love for Ben for 16 years out of fear of social and familial judgment, in your opinion, would her family have accepted the truth? Or was the cultural divide of that era simply too vast? Join the conversation in the comments. If Katherine's story moved you, share it. She deserves to be remembered for the weight of her life rather than the violence of her end. The resolution of the 1964 murder of Katherine Blackburn serves as a profound testament that truth is a persistent force and integrity is never in vain. This heartbreaking case provides several emotional and educational lessons for our time. The sacred duty of preservation. We must honor the silent legacy left by the investigators of 1964. Decades before DNA was even a concept, they processed the scene with clinical precision, wearing gloves and securing a single handkerchief that would one day speak. Their foresight proves that the work we do today, even if its full value isn't yet understood, can become the key to justice for future generations. The face of hidden evil. Katherine's life was defined by rhythm and devotion. She was a woman of unwavering faith who paid with her life for a single act of landlord civility, opening her door to a stranger. The killer, Joseph Nowakowski, was not a common thief but a methodical hunter who used newspapers to track his targets. Her story is a stark reminder to remain vigilant, as predators often mask their depravity behind the pretense of ordinary interactions. The miracle of persistence. The most moving lesson is found in Sandy, the niece who discovered Katherine at age 19 and scrubbed her blood from the floors to spare her own mother the horror. For 61 years, she refused to let the file dissolve into anonymity. At age 81, her lifelong petition was finally answered. It teaches us that hope is a marathon. Through relentless persistence, we can turn a cold case into a reclaimed history and finally find peace.